started, and start like just a minute or two early, but what the hell. Welcome to Amp Gallery and to the sort of live portion of what the gallery does, and it's one of my favorite things to do. Just a couple of things before we get started. I wanted to just invite you afterwards. We're going to have like a little reception and be able to hang out, buy a book, talk to Arlene, and have a little wine and cheese and whatever, and enjoy the art perhaps as well. And next week I have a new opening of work, and feel free to sign, get onto my mailing list, because I have a lot of openings and a lot of live events as well. And one in particular that's really one of my favorites is Tough Girls and Lucid Dreamers, and that's going to be happening on July 22nd. And a lot of fantastic performers, writers, and musicians. Also, Julia Salinger and Kate Wallace-Rogers are going to be reading here on the 24th of July. And a new addition, Sarah Schulman, is going to be doing a reading here on August 5th at 6 o'clock. And so without further ado, I'm so excited to welcome Arlene here. Arlene, she said this was too long-winded, but I don't care. I'm going to read it all. Arlene Stein is an award-winning professor of sociology at Rutgers University and director of the Institute for Research on Women. The author of 6 books, she received the Ruth Benedict Prize for her book, The Stranger Next Door. Other books include Reluctant Witnesses, Survivors, Their Children, and the Rise of Holocaust Consciousness, and that was from 2014. Shameless Sexual Dissidents in American Culture from 2006. Sex and Sensibility, Stories of a Lesbian Generation from 97. And Sister Sexperts Queers, Beyond the Lesbian Nation from 1993, where Arlene compiled and edited essays dealing with sexual mores and self-image from established and emerging writers and activists, like Susie Bright and etc. And if I leave anything out, just feel free to throw it on in. Arlene has also written for The Nation, Jacobin, The New Inquiry, among other publications. Her latest book that we're going to be focusing on today is Unbound, Transgender Men and the Remaking of Identity. And it's been now twice critically acclaimed by the New York Times. Just to sum it up really briefly, and then of course Arlene will take it away, but over the course of a year, Unbound, Arlene follows the lives of 4 individuals, Ben, Lucas, Parker, and Nadia, who all wish to feel more comfortable in their bodies. Arlene shows how members of this young transgender generation, along with other gender dissidents, are refashioning their identities and challenging others' conceptions of who they are. And especially now, during a time of this conservative, insanity and pushback, and all the personal costs involved with, taking this big leap, it's particularly brave and, particularly important work. And I just also want to add that she is my cousin. I'm really proud of her. Anyway, Arlene.
Debbie. Can I just say that Debbie's been promoting my work since I was about 3 or 4 years old. She continues to do so. And she continues to do such amazing work here in Provincetown.
Thank you.
And can I also say that, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, but at least Provincetown is here. I came to write the book, and I will read a little bit from it and then be happy to answer questions. So about 5 years ago, a friend of mine, Kate, came back from a trip to Florida and informed Cynthia and I, that Cynthia's my partner, she's back there, that she had accompanied a friend of hers who was having top surgery or chest surgery in Florida with a particularly celebrated doctor, and that she, witnessed a scene that she had never seen before, which was, maybe a dozen or 24 transmasculine individuals. So young people, mainly in their 20s, female assigned, who were many of them undergoing gender transitions, and who had made the decision to undergo top surgery. And Kate is from an earlier generation even than mine, and she had a hard time sort of making sense of what she saw at the doctor's office, and said that she was even more surprised by the fact that a lot of the individuals there had come with their parents, or many of the individuals there had come with their parents. So I heard this story, and the sociologist's light bulb immediately went off, and I thought, well, this is really interesting. I wanted to know more about who was there, who were those people in the office waiting for surgery, what were they trying to achieve by having the surgery, where did they come from? And I didn't really have a way, kind of a way of understanding that scene. So it sort of it inspired me to undertake this project. I didn't really have any transgender men in my life. I knew a few transgender women, but I didn't, even though I had studied sexuality and gender and taught the sociology of sexuality and gender for over 20 years, I didn't really know very much about the transgender world. Just read a little bit. For me, identifying as a feminist and a lesbian enables me to express my femaleness in ways that seem true enough, but over the years, I learned that there are others who feel that they were assigned a gender at birth that seems inauthentic and wrong, so much so that many seek out body modifications to bring their bodies into alignment with themselves. A number of years ago, I noticed a young man working in my campus bookstore who seemed vaguely familiar to me. I stared at him for several moments out of the corner of my eye, racking my brain to figure out how I knew him while trying my best not to attract his attention. Suddenly, I realized that he had once been a student of mine, and that I knew him as female, but now he had peach fuzz on his face, a deep voice, and was all but indistinguishable from other young men who worked alongside him selling camera equipment. But I was so ill-equipped to figure out how to respond that I pretended not to recognize him, and he did the same to me. So that was one incident along, a series of other incidents that sort of led to me undertaking this project. And I decided to try to interview people who were undergoing chest surgery in Florida with this doctor, who it turns out does more chest surgeries than anyone else in the world per year, and who bases his practice entirely on this procedure. So he serves the transmasculine population. He's the only one, to my knowledge, that does that. Although there are many other people who do trans surgeries, but not. He specializes in this. In terms of transmasculine surgery. So,
come on in. You can sit on the stairs too.
That's right. So I decided I would try to follow somebody who was undergoing the surgery, but I didn't really know how to do that. I didn't know anybody who was having the surgery themselves. And then I heard that it was very common for people to crowdsource or crowdfund for the surgery. So basically solicit contributions from friends and family and strangers on the web, which was a phenomenon in itself. And there were dozens, if not hundreds of people who were crowdfunding for top surgery. And I decided, well, I had sabbatical, or I had actually a spring break. I thought I can go on this day or this day. Maybe I can find someone who's having surgery that day and get them to allow me to interview them and to sort of view kind of what their whole process is. And practically the first person I asked said yes. His name is Ben, and he became a central character and subject of the book. So I went down to Florida and I met Ben, and he was there with his parents, a 29-year-old from Maine. Ben sits in the waiting room of a plastic surgery clinic at a strip mall in South Florida. It is 8 in the morning and he barely slept the night before. Drawn by word of mouth and the power of the internet, he has driven 1,500 miles to see a surgeon who will masculinize his chest. Ever since the surgery was scheduled 6 months ago, he's been counting the days until he can look in the mirror and see a flat chest. Now it's nearly here and his excitement is palpable. A high-energy 29-year-old who spent 10 years as a photographer in the extreme water sports industry and as a political organizer before deciding to return to college, Ben calls himself a super late bloomer. Bess, as he was then known, short for Elizabeth, befriended a couple of transgender men while working on a campaign for marriage equality in Maine, where he lived. He felt a sudden frisson of recognition, which led him to wonder whether his lifelong feelings of estrangement from his body and his femaleness meant that he was transgender. "So I think I'm having a gender crisis," he told his good friend Allison. "Dude, OMG, that makes perfect sense," she replied. "You've always hated your boobs." During the next year, Ben underwent a process of soul searching that led him to undergo a gender transition. He asked his friends and family to call him Ben while he went on testosterone, investigated the possibility of surgically modifying his body, and posted that message on GoFundMe that led me to him. While I was there, I made contact with everybody else who was having surgery the same day as Ben. So there were 5 others and 4 others, and 3 agreed to speak to me.
Wow.
So I interviewed them there, and I continued to talk with them over the course of a year, visited some of them, and also interviewed close family and friends of some of them. Well, friends of all of them and close family of some of them. The first surprise of the project was how willing people were to talk with me. Not a trans person, middle-aged, lesbian, sociologist, and I'm not in their world, and they were totally forthcoming and really wanted to tell their stories, which I thought was part of, sort of part of the story of this book, is that this generation that I'm focusing on is really, really wants to be out to the extent that they can, which is really quite new, right? The other kind of finding and revelation is, and sort of related to this wanting to be out, is this generation completely blurs the private and the public sphere. Like, there is no separation between the two. They post about everything. They, or almost everything. They, they just don't have the kind of boundaries that a lot of us who grew up in an earlier moment have about revealing a lot of sort of personal information, which of course for me was a great thing because it made my job a lot easier. So the book focuses on top surgery, in part because for this population, top surgery is sort of one of the signal events on the road to transition, on the road to becoming recognizable in the world as males. A lot of people sort of the stereotype about transgender and transsexualism before transgender was that it's all about the genitals. The surgery focuses on the genitals. And actually, for the population of transgender men, that's not really the case at all. In part because phalloplasty, genital surgery, is very, very difficult, has not yet been perfected, is very, very expensive. but also because this younger generation has, I see, it seems to me, a more expansive understanding of gender that is not necessarily as tied to the genitals, tied to this, you know, sort of the phallus, as you might expect. Another theme of the book is the differences between the generations. So my generation and the generation of a lot of the folks here today, we were very invested in tamping down gender, like minimizing the differences between males and females, embracing androgyny, wearing unisex clothes, you know, I still dress like that, right? And we were very invested in gender equality, in embracing androgynous styles, in making the world a safer place for gays and lesbians. And this generation follows some of those projects, continues some of those projects, but they have a very different take on things. Rather than try to tamp down gender, they want to see 1,000 genders bloom. Like they just, you know, there's a much greater emphasis on gender self-expression. Hence, you know, all the names for different forms of gender that you see on Facebook and various other places. And they're very invested in a critique of the gender binary, the belief that the world is divided into male and female. One of the people who I focus on is named Lucas, and he illustrates some of these ideas. 23-year-old Lucas DeMonte from Gainesville, Florida, is a health educator who identifies as a queer, genderqueer trans man. He's got a scruffy beard, a fairly high voice, ends a lot of statements with a rising intonation, says like a lot, as in I was like ready for top surgery, and comes off as kind and caring. Good qualities for someone who works as an HIV prevention counselor doing condom distribution and safe sex education, as well as trans education. Lucas double majored in psychology and women's studies, and his crowdfunding profile says that he cares about animal welfare, children, civil rights and social action, and disaster and humanitarian relief, among other issues, in addition to transgender health. In my spare time, he says, I write and perform spoken word, pet cute fuzzy things, and smash the system spelled C-I-S, as in cisgender. I never felt like I was born in the wrong body, says Lucas, referring to the dominant medical discourse, although he hated looking in the mirror, he says, and felt extreme discomfort with the body he had. Lucas had been binding his chest for 2 years using a compression sports bra, always a little too tight, usually followed by a t-shirt and a man's shirt. He does so for safety because he sometimes goes to rural Florida, very small, really southern places, he says, doing HIV education. If they knew I was queer, let alone trans, I would probably be killed, so I have to kind of keep that very much on the down low when I'm doing work out in the community, he says. But to his co-workers, he is very, very out. For Lucas, undergoing top surgery is an assertion of what some feminists call body autonomy. Pro-choice activists argue that the government has no right to tell women what to do with their body. Transgender activists say that they too have the right to change their body if they please. Lucas is at the surgeon's office with Oliver, a former boyfriend, who's also a bearded trans man, and Rachel, a bisexual Latina, his soulmate and sister, he says. Lucas says he's always known he wanted top surgery even before he began injecting testosterone. A few friends who had undergone surgery with this particular doctor became mentors to younger trans people in town like Lucas, directing them to friendly therapists and doctors and helping them get letters for testosterone. And having crowdfunded the $7,000 he needed for top surgery, Lucas is giving away $500, he says, to charity. So Lucas is very much a feminist, as he he identifies himself. He's very guilty about his newfound male privilege, he says, after he transitions. He says that people now take him much more seriously, that he presents in the world as male. And interestingly, he works at a female-dominated job, as a health educator and social worker, and even people there take him more seriously, and many of them know about his transition. So, one could imagine that people in male-dominated professions would benefit from this newfound male privilege, but even, as his story suggests, even people in female-dominated professions also benefit at times, especially if they're white. If they're not, it's a little bit more complicated. He, even though he wants to present as a man or as masculine, he identifies as genderqueer and as non-binary, and in some ways his desire to present as masculine is an attempt to minimize social conflicts that might occur with strangers and minimize the possibility of violence. But also he feels himself to be very masculine, and he wants his body to reflect that. And then there's Parker. Parker Price has dirty blonde, straight, stringy hair and a chiseled face. There's a lot of good-natured bluster about him, part hip-hop, part hippie, and lots of vanity. He resembles a younger, shorter Brad Pitt, who also happens to be one of his favorite actors, particularly in the role of Tyler Durden in the 1999 film Fight Club. Chuck Palahniuk's story of men engaged in violence to combat the numbing effects of living in a consumer-oriented society. Parker's Instagram feed is filled with photos of him wearing sports jerseys and ripped jeans, holding joints, and drinking bottles of beer. He's a bad boy, a player. Thanks to testosterone in his chest binder, Parker is stealth at work, which means he has made a choice not to disclose his transgender history to those he meets. He presents as a cisgender male. While those who have known him for a while, including most of his colleagues, know full well that Parker used to go by the name Kate, new hires, he works in software marketing. New hires generally have no idea he is transitioning. Ultimately, Parker says he'd like to be stealth in most aspects of his life. If someone asked him if he's transgender, he would tell them the truth, but he doesn't want to live in between. He wants to be known as a man, or as masculine. Actually, he wants to be known as a man, I would say. I'm grateful that I have more of a strong male identity because that just works with my personality, he says, and he's determined to transition as completely as he can and become male in the eyes of the world and to himself. In many respects, he seems to conform to the conventional notion of the, quote, man trapped in a woman's body, end of quote. As he sees it, his true gender lies beneath his exterior, waiting to be claimed. Some more on Parker. When I ask him what he would like his life to be like in 5 years, he replies with a hint of irony, maybe in 5 years, just get hella white collar with it, investment properties. Basically, just be financially secure enough. In 9 years, have some kids. So he's like 23 when I interviewed him. In 9 years, have some kids. Yeah, I want to be a white American male property owner. Really, it's a dream. And his girlfriend who's there with him says, I think he'll be a great dad one day. He's such a good teacher. He can explain things really well. And I think that's a good trait in a dad. Parker tells me that he can picture himself in the future as an old man. Not, quote, not as a little old granny. Which I thought was a really interesting comment.
Yeah.
And a little disconcerting too, right? And this is me commenting on it. Of course, women's aging bodies, their sagging thighs, and withered cleavage are a source of derision, even hatred. while men are often seen as more distinguished, more powerful as they age. Is Parker buying into the misogyny that is pervasive in our culture? I asked Parker, what's the worst thing about getting old and becoming a little old granny? He responds, if I grow old as a woman, I will never be seen by a lover for who I am. When you're having sex and you look in their eyes and know that they're seeing you for who you are, end of quote. His voice cracks. As a granny, no one would have seen me, end of quote. So that was, for me, that was a really kind of, it was moving, and also kind of that was a light bulb moment in writing this book when he used those words. When it comes down to it, Parker simply wants the same things we all do, to be seen and understood by others, and to be desired and even loved for who we are. He spoke of the fear of having a life that was unlived. The quest for male privilege and securing material and other comforts plays a role in his decision to transition, to be sure, but it's much more than that. Transitioning will, he hopes, enable him to put all the pieces of the puzzle together so that he can see himself as a, quote, whole person, and so that others can see that person too. So you can see here that people who identify as transgender men have a wide range of different understandings of what that means to them. A wide range of, I've only talked about really 2-3 people, but they all had really very different understandings of what it meant to be transgender, what it meant to be a transgender man, and what masculinity meant. So you have Lucas, who is this fierce genderqueer feminist who sees his own transgenderness as kind of a compromise, like he's really conflicted about it in many ways. And then you have Parker, who is a gung-ho, almost kind of macho guy, who is, at least at the early point of our discussions, was far less conflicted about his masculinity, although it changed to some extent over time. My fourth subject that I focus on is Nadia, who, even though she's undergoing top surgery, she identifies as female. She's not undergoing, she's not in the midst of a gender transition. Nadia is a gender bender who wants to modify her body and still be recognized as female. For a while she considered simply getting a breast reduction. Maybe smaller breasts would do the trick, she says she wondered. Then I thought that if I'm going to go through a procedure like that, I don't want to still have to wear a binder. Why would I just settle on a breast reduction? Scanning the internet for stories of others like her, she found a couple of women who also decided to remove their breasts, but who didn't identify as trans. Some butch lesbians have top surgery too. 28-year-old Nadia is one of them. When Nadia announced that she wanted to remove her breasts, her girlfriend wondered whether it meant that Nadia wanted to become a man. Nadia assured her it didn't. The term dysphoria, which is a medical term for distress caused by disparity between one's gender assignment and one's gender identity, which is a term that a lot of trans people identify with, never spoke to her, so she never saw herself as dysphoric per se. She wasn't seeking to change her gender. She says, my breasts just don't reflect who I am. A former girlfriend once asked her if her breasts were fake. Nadia, she said, you have great boobs. But I didn't want great boobs, she said. I didn't want those things at all. So you can see that different people are seeking different things from the surgery, although Nadia is a bit of an outlier. Most of the people at the surgeon's office are undergoing gender transitions. But Nadia, in some ways, is part of this larger cohort of millennial, genderqueer folks who believe that it's their right to change their bodies if they please. They, for them, plastic surgery of this sort is, far less taboo than it might have been for people of my generation. They're part of this, conversation about gender, I think that is kind of new and different and interesting, that I'm only, now trying, sort of beginning to sort of make sense of. And I wouldn't say that I've gotten it all, but I'm trying. I think what I'm going to do now is end the formal part of this program. But I welcome, so the book is a story of these 4 individuals. Their experiences with top surgery provide sort of the entry point. But I follow their lives over time for a year and try to figure out, what it is, sort of what transitioning means for the 3 of them, how, sort of how they understand their gender as it evolves over time, and sort of what it all means in terms of, what does it say to us, the rest of us who are not necessarily a part of this population, but who are, sort of watching it from afar or not watching it and are kind of curious about what it means. I will end there, and I welcome your comments, questions, or anything else.
So, I love that phrase, smashing the system, CIS. I think that, and I'm an academic researcher myself, and just starting a project on trans people at work, more in their work employment, not so much about the transition, but more about the employment. And I keep wondering if, being not of the millennial generation, if this idea of smashing the system is a project that could replace the smashing the patriarchy, or a project that actually, I can't quite tell, and it feels a little bit like from, I haven't made it all the way through the book yet, but will shortly. I'm hopeful that it could be, if we could just expand beyond the binary, maybe we could also kill the patriarchy as we're going along. But I wonder if you came out of this project feeling like that was a possibility or not.
That the transgender movement is also about smashing the patriarchy? Is that what you're
Or that somehow by moving to this smashing the system, that sort of replaces the more binary project of the patriarchy.
Good question, which I'm not really sure that I can totally answer, but I'm not sure that it replaces it. I think it's maybe a similar and related project. I think the patriarchy still exists.
Oh yeah, no,
as we all know right now.
Yeah.
As we all know, yeah, it seems to be getting stronger by the moment. I think there's a lot going on in this generation.